So this is a fantastic opportunity for an impromptu interview with Hugh Eaton, who is defence security analyst, digital transformation expert into organisational design, leadership and numerous other things. With a background in the army, as well as consulting and commerce, he draws on an extraordinary range of skills and insights. And we're going to be looking, because we are at a defence conference, we're going to be talking about defence and resilience and how actually compartmentalising various things such as energy resilience, societal resilience, media resilience, and compartmentalising away from defence resilience is probably the wrong way to go about it. That was a lightning introduction. Hugh, could you give us a little bit more sort of depth and detail on your background?
Yeah, happily. So my name is Hugh. I'm a defence partner at Boston Consulting Group. Prior to that, I ran the global government business for Microsoft. And prior to that, I ran the European and Middle East public sector at Cisco. So that was the sort of tech phase of my career. And before that, I had a 18-year first career in the British Army, where I spent a lot of my time in Iraq, both times, in Sierra Leone, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, around South America, in Northern Ireland, and had quite a lot of experience of the situation we find ourselves in now as we move towards potential reconstruction in Ukraine. So good to talk to you.
It's a fantastic opportunity. Let's start with, I think, one of the perennial problems, not just for military analysts and experts, for politicians, bureaucrats. I think this is across the board. We tend to fight the previous war and interpret things through that framework. Ukraine has this curious blend. I think I heard it described earlier today as a kind of Mad Max war, where you have extraordinary high-tech, rapid advancements combined with First World War trenches. Do we do ourselves a disservice if we constantly try to compare it to previous wars rather than actually observe what is going on and how we should specifically respond to the unique circumstance that is the Ukraine-Russia war, or Russia-Ukraine war?
I think it's a really good example of the fact that new technology is adding complexity to the battle space rather than replacing some old version of complexity. I suppose we don't need to find, fodder for our horses anymore. But, you make a very good point around the trenches. I mean, even more illustrative are the complex and depth minefields and obstacles that the Russians have used in Ukraine. And that just brings to life your point around the additive complication of this new technology, most notably things like drones. And what it's doing is it's adding to the complexity that already exists. So rather than fighting the last war, I think what we need to do, and we are trying to do this, is to understand how does that combination of challenge affect the way that we do our business going forward. And let me give you one example for that. In Iraq and Afghanistan, you will know that we lent heavily, at least in the British military and certainly in the American military, on close air support and on battlefield interdiction from manned, crewed airframes. The advent and growth of drones and integrated mobile air defence, both in terms of man pads, but short and long range air defence weaponry, has really challenged that space. So in the UK, as an example, we've invested a lot in that sort of crude, CAS battlefield interdiction piece, and we're having to really rethink very quickly how do we actually approach that going forward without losing a lot of pilots, because between Iraq, Afghanistan and Ukraine, things have changed.
And other areas, I think, are having a real challenge catching up. Well, let's start with the Strategic Defence Review. We don't know what's in it. We know who some of the contributors are. One of them's here today, Fiona Hill. Other people like Keir Giles and others have put input in there at least to try and describe, the Russian way of war and peace. And in fact, Russian war and peace are indistinguishable at this point. It's aggression on all fronts, utilizing everything they have to hand, including their soft power as well as cyber and so on. Are you optimistic that all of this, I would say, holistic warfare that Russia's engaged in is going to be taken into account in the Strategic Defence Review? Or are we going to be led by fairly misleading red herring numbers such as 2.5%, 3.5% of GDP rather than specific outcomes?
Yeah, I think one of the major criticisms of this, and you heard Fiona Hill downstairs talk about this arbitrary figure, is that it is an input. And not only is it arbitrary, not only do many NATO countries not even live up to it, but those that do, including ourselves, calculate it in different ways. So as a symbolic number, I think it's fine. What we absolutely must do is have a qualitative underpinning to it, because, as you well know, things have significantly changed recently, and I'm much less concerned about this sort of harbinger of dooms talking about the US withdrawal from NATO. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't even think it's in the US interest for it to happen. What I think is we are seeing, and I believe it is not going to revert post a Trump presidency, is now really the reality that Europeans should take responsibility for the Atlantic Eurozone. Now, the Americans have been helping out for 80 years. There was an article that you may have seen in the Times the other day, Max Hastings, saying we should be less surprised about the fact that it's finished, but rather surprised that it lasted as long as it did. Eisenhower was the first American president to complain about burden sharing. And there's been we all know the presidents in between who, things like Libya was a reflection of, the US will lead from behind. There was the strategic direction in the US in 2012 where they moved away from their ambition to maintain capacity and scale and capability to fight 2 wars at any one time, to revert to 1 war. Well, that 1 war is quite clearly, or that one area of focus is quite clearly the Indo-Pacific and China. And so the fact that we have now materially got to address specifically and in detail the alliance construct and how we as a confederation achieve the whole means that we've got to go beyond that figure. And I think I'd say 2 things about it. The first is that, and as you may know, we are proposing what we're calling the London formula for sitting underneath that, those headline numbers. It's we are using the adjective primed, where P is political will and engagement, R is readiness of forces and capability, the I is interoperability and how effective these countries' militaries are in working in an alliance construct, the M is for modernization and digitization, the E is for enablers, the strategic enablers, things like ISR, things like strategic lift. And then the D stands for defense support. So how do these countries operate as staging posts? Do they offer their airfields? Do they offer basing? Do they offer refueling capacity? These sorts of things that an alliance very much needs. So we need a qualitative underpinning, not to complicate, but to understand, partly because we talked earlier about a recent poll where 2/3 of the British public are very much against any additional public defence spending. So we need to be really clear how we're spending that money so that it's evident to the British public, the taxpayer who are giving us the money, that we're spending it on the right things for the right reasons. And that needs more than just some arbitrary number. And even the noise outside illustrates the fact that not everybody is supportive of what we're trying to do here. That's the first thing. The second thing, and perhaps more specifically to your question, is you're exactly right. The Chinese and the Russians have a very well developed policy and doctrinal base for what they call cognitive warfare. In a Western liberal democracy like ours, that becomes a confusing coupling of words, particularly because in cognitive warfare we are talking about an enduring 24/7 long-term ambition for one state to influence the population of another, done in different ways through different mechanisms, but it's not the sort of info ops that is related to a tactical mission or even a medium-term engagement. It is about very long-term, very foundational changes, desired change to the way that a population thinks about things. And this is something that the UK and indeed the US and across NATO we're very bad at. We have been bad at. And if you look, and my friends at Oxford have done the research at this, we have very little to say about it. And so what that means is we need to look at smart power at a government state level and recognize what's in there from a hard power, kinetic end perspective, obviously with nuclear on the right-hand side, the extreme of the spectrum, but also to understand soft power and what are those. We're starting to try and understand what sanctions are. I'm not sure historically whether they've actually ever worked, but you might know more. But economic warfare, influence operations, and then what is it that we're going to do as an always-on 24/7 position to try and support our belief in freedoms and values, but also to defend against those that would wish to change our minds and our population's views. It's a really tricky area for a Western liberal democracy because it has all the obvious implications about state control of other states, state control of our own state, and potential misuse and so forth. What we're saying is that the time has come where we have to be really deliberate about it, and it's not the same as saying we've got to go, full steam ahead into some minute monitoring of our population or anybody else's. But we do have to be very deliberate, and we have to be alert to the fact that others who may wish us harm are much better developed in that full spectrum, soft and hard power, composite elements of smart power.
We should explain, of course, what the noise is. There's a major protest going on outside. I'm sure people can guess what that relates to. And retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who's been on the channel quite a number of times, has stated repeatedly that one of the challenges here, of course, you have political communication. You're not going to get your population to buy into defence spending unless you clearly communicate not just why they're in danger, but how you're going to deal with it, and that you actually have a solution to this problem. That brings up one of the real issues of the last 3 years, is we seem to have no actual strategy to deal with Russia, no strategy to push them out of Ukraine, no strategy for victory, and very little discussion or idea about how you go about containing a malign Russia. There's this hope that they will perhaps revert back to the softer phase of the 90s. Whereas you speak to experts, that's not happening, and yet we're not talking about how to deal with the long-term challenge from Russia.
Well, that is undeniably true. As Ben would have told you, and as you know yourself, there are multiple complicating factors, but let's just consider a few of them with the desire and the intent that recognizing them can move us to a point of greater clarity around our position. I think that, and this is not to make excuses for our own lack of strategic leadership, but it has been a confusing period for not just NATO, but for those countries that used to constitute this rules-based international order, this sort of dreamy space that will never return. It will never return in the format that it was, because you know from living abroad, I know from spending a lot of time living abroad, that it was never an international rules-based order. It was our international rules-based order, and people have made it very clear they're not going to sign up to it anymore. But still, we would like some, guidelines around how nations can deal amicably with other nations, including the tensions that are generated by a competitive trade environment and limited human resources and uber challenges like migration and climate change. But not, from a UK perspective, not fully understanding where the US position has been a complicating factor. There has always been, as you know, a considerable fear certainly in the UK, but in other nations too, of what would happen if we escalate and then Putin escalates, and do we find ourselves in a nuclear exchange? All of which underpinned by or in the context of a sort of unhelpful, but I just got to be transparent about it, sense amongst lots of people in quite a challenging time domestically, coming out of COVID. And I'm talking here about the full invasion of Ukraine, not going back to 2014. But although we can, this is, we were coming out of COVID. There was a sort of energy crisis. There was, a cost of living crisis. These will sound excuses, but it's in the nature of humans that they tend to turn in on themselves. And there was, and to some extent there still is, whilst we are undoubtedly in support of Ukraine, a sense that at some point we don't want to expend all our blood and treasure on a conflict that is, some distance away. And for many people, and one has to, it may come across as unsavory, but that you need to recognize the public audience, the domestic political environment. And there just are people who feel that some of that investment should be closer to home. So I think there's a combination of fear of escalation on one side, uncertainty around the part we were to play alongside or instead of the US. Several other European countries took even longer than we did in gathering sort of internal momentum, which ultimately converted into useful help. But all of that said, and you will have heard this phrase before, but I do subscribe to it, which is it still seems like we gave Ukraine enough not to fail, but not enough to win. Now, in that sort of mid-state, one can't expect a sovereign nation to exist. So the fact that there are dynamics, some of them less attractive than others, and perhaps some of them driven by economics rather than ideology or a sense of mutual support, but the fact that things may be moving towards some sort of conclusion, I think is we need to support, because we have not. To go back to the beginning of your question there, what is our strategy for Ukraine? Well, it has been loosely to ensure that Putin can't win, but we haven't really effectively allowed Ukraine to win. So we've come up with a sort of hodgepodge, but we've never given Putin a strategic dilemma. He's running, as you know, a command economy, 40% of GDP going into supporting the military, running out of conscripts, paying conscripts, going off to places like Kyrgyzstan and illegally seeking to recruit those individuals or some individuals from that country. But we haven't made the sustainment of his illegal activity sufficiently unattractive that he desists. That is manifestly true because we are where we are today.
And maybe the only thing he would really care about is something that destabilizes his regime. Everything else is expendable, maybe in his terms. Well, let's turn to solutions, because of course what Sir Keir Starmer will be, I'm sure, told, and it's rumoured by his military chiefs, is that it's all very well to promise this, that and the other, a deterrence force, but we just don't have the resource and the capability, and to build that capacity takes a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of will behind there as well, which of course is difficult to muster. What could we realistically do? Because Ukrainians will tell us, and they have told us, don't worry, we will do the fighting, but you need to create some space where we can do that without precipitous losses. One of those things could be perhaps relieving Ukrainian troops who are manning the borders of Belarus or in the west, or it could be enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukrainian occupied territory, say up to the Dnipro. Are either of those two realistic in terms of capacity and will from the side of Britain and its so-called alliance of the willing?
Well, I think from a capacity perspective, they would contribute, but we have to be very careful here, Jonathan. I know you are, but you are not. But we must not conflate the concept of a contribution to a post-ceasefire environment to a pre-ceasefire shaping environment where we are then clearly, and according to the Geneva Convention and the rules of armed conflict, we are a combatant. Now, it may be, there may come a point in time where that is determined to be the only way forward to prevent to deal with Putin. I'm not sure we're there yet, and I am relatively confident that the British public would not support that, and I'm relatively confident that Keir Starmer would not make such a decision without going to Parliament, and I'm very confident that Parliament would not pass that. So I think the idea of creating capability benefit of the type that you're describing in a combatant sense, in a pre-ceasefire sense, is highly unlikely. So if we then move to the condition in which, as you know, it's been posited, then I absolutely think there are gains to be made. There is advantage to offer the Ukrainian military, who would, of course, by dint of circumstance, be going through a different evolution themselves in that way. But the boots on the ground, as you know, I mean, I think we are talking about maximum a brigade. As you know, it's broadly speaking, I mean, brigades can change because they're all batted to the circumstance. But it wouldn't be more than 8,000 or 9,000, and it would probably be more likely about 5,000, of which probably around I would imagine, maybe 4 battle groups, maybe sort of 3,000 or so would be kind of frontline troops, and the rest would be supporting in various ways. But all of that, as you know, still requires, when you're talking about multi-domain operations, you've still got to protect your strategic depth. You still need the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance asset. You still need to be able to combine through the sort of multi-domain integration the capabilities that you require from space, the defense and offensive signals intelligence through cyber, and obviously maritime, air, and land. And a brigade, as you know, covers a relatively limited amount of space when you think of the sort of front line, or what would become maybe a boundary line, or you'll recall in the Balkans, the front line became the inter-entity boundary line, and now forms the border between the Federation of Bosnia and Republika Srpska, and there would be something similar. So a brigade doesn't go a very long way in terms of conventional coverage, but it's not really trying to provide conventional coverage in that context. It is as much as anything a statement of political will and a marker in the ground that says, Putin, actually, don't come any further than this line. And then your second point around the air thing, I think is very interesting, because there's people and there's people, friends of mine who are Ukrainians who look at the situation in Israel. They look at the Iron Dome. They look at the support that's gone into. Now the Iron Dome is an Israeli national defense capability, much and consistently supported by the US. But you will recall that when there were drone strikes fired at and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles fired at Israel from other nations, then other nations did put planes in the air, including the UK, to provide some air defense for Israel. Now, Ukrainian friends of mine are saying we don't quite get the difference there, because that isn't, that is a defensive construct, and I think you're then, if one can talk about the safer end of the spectrum of escalation, you are at that safer end.
And it raises a couple of interesting issues, doesn't it? Because one is deterrence. Is that size of force actually a deterrent factor to Putin? But actually, maybe an even more pertinent point is he's not looking at this saying, oh, okay, which side of the Geneva Convention are we on? He's going to look at the optics of this, and he may well want to implicate foreign forces and turn them into combatants, make them complicit, as it were, in a war, in that definition of war, and then use that propagandistically in all sorts of ways. He's certainly dragged North Korea into this. He's got recruits from the African continent and all over. In a way, Putin is quite happy. In fact, it suits his purposes to turn this into a world war.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely accurate. I'm sure that's what would happen. As we move, God willing, into some sort of cessation, and we talked before, all wars end. Their consequences endure, but the kinetic exchanges end. They do end. It seems like they're endless, but they do end. They end in unexpected and unjust and unjustifiable ways, but they do end. And if we are coming to some sort of culmination point, it links back to what you asked a few minutes ago, which is our capacity to understand and implement, whether in an offensive or defensive manner, the full spectrum, the full range of smart power, both hard and soft. Because you're 100% right. That is what will happen. They'll be already planning it now. They'll have planned for it since I'm sure that since they started the march on Kiev, which is to say, right, okay, any sort of ceasefire moment, that's not the end of our ambition in the world. It's not the end of our ideological approach to the security of the Russian state. So exactly right, discrediting. I personally think it's much more likely that through disinformation, our presence will be discredited. I think that's a much more likely form of attack, and it is a form of attack, than a kinetic attack, than them being shot at, or the Russian military conducting a military attack against a obviously British target. Now, if they're collateral damage, or the Russians can claim that's collateral damage, I'm sure that could be a factor. But cyber attacks, disinformation, this cognitive warfare piece that we're talking about, that is part of their doctrine. And as you know, and you were saying, I think earlier, that for them, they shift very easily between these states, and for them, and you're more of a Russian expert than I am, but violence is not at the sort of top of their escalatory ladder. Mm-hmm. Violence can happen anywhere and everywhere, and then stop. And we don't think of it in those sort of ways. And I'm very aware and a little concerned that because I've experienced this international community dynamic before. I've experienced it in Iraq several times. I've experienced it in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, in South America, other places where as one approaches, as the international community approaches some sort of decision point in an armed conflict, interest grows, investment grows. It's in the news the whole time, so there is both international and domestic advantage for politicians and others. The private sector becomes interested by, return on investment. And then it hits a plateau as we actually get the sort of, security sector reform or the reconstruction and trying to get human capital to return, trying to control some of these and support these elements. And then quite quickly, in my experience, you get a bit of a drop off because actually it's very difficult. This is difficult business, reconstructing a country, supporting a country, even with the innovation, the creativity, the energy of Ukraine. It's hard work. And imagining that everybody is going to agree about how we do that as an international community supporting a nation is, one shouldn't imagine that because that won't happen. And then it's just how you disagree and how you can manage to make progress whilst disagreeing. So I think this is, it's a really timely moment to be asking governments to be thinking these things through and to have a plan for how they're going to manage them. Specifically, if I may, this point around qualitative assessment of contribution to a different sort of NATO for the Euro-Atlantic and some of those, what we're calling the London formula, but some of those more qualitative principles that sit underneath how we spend our money, but allied with your point around let's look at hard power and soft power. I mean, I think it was an unfortunate moment when the government decided to take money out of the aid budget and put it into defence. And I said to you before, I was a soldier, my father was a soldier, my son is a soldier. If anybody wants to support the military, it's me. But I want us to spend smarter and there you can build a strong argument that actually if we want to be, secure at home and strong abroad, then taking money out of our aid budget, it doesn't follow that that's a very smart thing to do.
Before we head on to the last question, it's probably a good idea to break down what the London formula is.
I think, judging by conversations I've had with American senior military leaders, politicians, British senior military leaders, politicians, delegates and members of parliament here today, is we've got to provide a qualitative contribution to this figure of 2.5 or 2.65. We've got to do it for two reasons. We need to understand internationally, we need to be able to present to our international allies and our alliance allies how we are spending that money. We need to be able to see how they are spending their money, and we need to be able to persuade our own taxpayers, you and me, and our families, that we are paying money for the right things, that there is smart application of those funds. So we use the adjective primed, where P is for political will and how actually engaged and committed are these countries. The R is for readiness. So from a troop perspective and a equipment perspective, are they ready to actually engage and deploy and operate? The I is interoperability because we are an alliance and we need to work. And some of the challenges we had in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Kosovo, in Bosnia. The M is for modernization and digitization. So let's raise all boats in terms of the integration of space, cyber assets, artificial intelligence. The E is for enablers, strategic enablers, particularly with the US pivoting more out to the Indo-Pacific. We're going to have to look at things like strategic lift. We're going to have to look at things like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR assets. So that will be very important. And then the D of primed, this adjective we're using, is around defence support. So that includes things like, does it provide basing, logistics? Are there sort of host nation support contributions that an alliance needs to be able to operate and have some sorts of geographical freedoms? So those are what we have proposed as the London formula, not to replace a single figure, because I think it can be helpful in certain environments to have that, but we're at a time where we must get more specific and qualitative about how we are spending our money, both so we can present it to our alliance friends, and we can see and understand how they're spending their money, and also we can respond to the British public, whose support we need throughout this, that we are spending their money wisely.
And the last one, I think that's really, really clear. The last question here, and it relates to where we are today and the defence review that's going on, and Fiona Hill, who's here, is one of the contributors to that. Lots of talk about the 2.5% and 3.5%. We've sort of touched upon that already. But surely one of the challenges here is not what we spend, or even what we think is important, but actually, rather than marking our own homework in a sort of classic administrative own goal, surely the real judgment here is what the Russians think of this. Does it have real deterrence power? Do they update anything in their strategic framework based on a perceived increase in threat or an increased cost to their actions that come from us building our deterrence power? Isn't that the true framework to actually judge our strategies, plans, and their execution?
Well, I think it is undoubtedly a part of it, and I think your suggestion of it is really helpful, and we will certainly have a look at that for sure, because I think it's a part of it. And from a business perspective, from a military capability perspective, and from a strategy perspective, you'll know that you do have to look at inputs and outputs. Having this primed methodology, applying the sort of London formula, will allow us to see those other input factors from a capability perspective. So what are countries intending to do, and how are they intending to do it, and what are the qualitative dynamics of that? That is beneficial, that is useful, that helps you to plan and strategize. And we must include your suggestion. We must include, when you set out, you set out on a military mission or a political mission, diplomatic mission, a business mission. You seek to understand what constitutes success. So what does success look like? And if we talk to your point around deterrence and the perception of deterrence in Ukraine, I find it sort of quite confusing, and I'm not even sure if there is a definitive position, because you and I were talking earlier. There are those, and I know many of them, and so do you, who say, well, actually, it's an example. Ukraine is a tragedy, and it's an example of NATO's deterrent success, because Putin is not having lunch in London or Paris or Berlin. He's not even having lunch in Kiev. So therefore, it's a success. And then you and I both know people who say Ukraine is a tragedy, and it's an example of NATO's failure to deter Putin because it is going on. And then there's lines in the middle. So I think, to your point, we need to construct a set of responses, actions, and we could be quite specific about this in terms of Putin reinforcing forces, what's happening with his with conscription, what's happening with retention in his military, what's happening with investment, what's happening with the command economy. how effective we're being with primary and secondary sanctions, and the short version of that is we're quite effective with primary and very ineffective with secondary sanctions. What impact are we making to his economy? What impact are we having elsewhere? I think that there are a set of, what the military would call indicators and warnings that we can draw a list of, and then we see where we have moved that. I suppose what you are seeking, and I think we will do, is to put those sort of qualitative precision underneath what I was talking about earlier in terms of presenting Putin with a strategic dilemma, that collectively we create the conditions where it's just not worth it in his calculus to continue to do what he's doing. We haven't achieved that yet. Whatever these numbers have been, whatever the qualitative strengths and weaknesses have been, we haven't achieved. If we had achieved it, he would have stopped. He hasn't stopped, therefore we are currently failing. And what we will do over the next short while as we strengthen this London formula for the Prime Minister and for politicians and members of Parliament to look at and strengthen is a set of conditions that we would seek to understand and then apportion, success or failure, and then accordingly we can then sort of moderate and adjust our plan. But I think that will be an important addition too.
Well, this is definitely a topic we should do a follow-up on, especially as this unfolds and you start putting specific objectives and detail against this framework. For today, though, thank you so much. Thank you for persevering with the extraordinary background noise that's going on there. It's
really, quite a lot.
Yeah, quite energetic. No comment on that. Hopefully it won't disrupt people's sort of enjoyment of the extraordinary detail in this conversation. Yeah. For today, though, Hugh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.